So before I begin, has anybody here had their sense of humor surgically removed? Please raise your hand. Okay, that's good. Because there will be humor, and let's face it, if you're sitting next to somebody and they laugh and you don't laugh, it makes you look bad. So, for my ego, please. It's hard to know. Hang on a second. I think I got to push that over a little bit. It's hard to know always when you get ready to do a presentation to a group of people who know more about respiratory therapy than you do now, what it is that I ought to talk about. So they had two suggestions for me. One of them was about staffing, and the other was about the disciplinary process. So in formulating my objectives, what I said was I wanted to try and give you a view of the disciplinary process, why discipline gets pursued, how it gets pursued, the difference between ordinary negligence and gross negligence, because generally speaking, if you make a mistake, if you're negligent in some way, that may give rise to a civil claim against you, but it shouldn't affect your license unless you're just doing it all the time. And then understanding strategies to help you protect both your license and your livelihood through litigation avoidance. So here's the good news. The good news is you guys are heroes, every last one of you, because you've fought through this damned pandemic and you've prevailed. And I think you deserve a big round of applause for that, because you guys did the work that nobody else could do. And the next time somebody says something to you about, oh, what's a respiratory therapist do? You can say, we make a difference. That's what we do. So that's the good news. But when I was in the Army, I had a drill sergeant once who said that 100 attaboys could be wiped out by one aw crap. And that brings us to the bad news, which is that you can destroy all of that good karma that you've earned if you portray an attitude to your patients that suggests you just really don't give a darn. So I think it's really important to understand, first off, how much attitude and demeanor, and most importantly, communication, reflects on how people perceive you and what they will be willing to do for you or do to you. So the first question I wanted to get into was this question about how discipline works. And we often think about discipline in the context of you make a mistake in a case, or you're alleged to have made a mistake in a case, and they run to the state board and they complain, and the state board starts a case against you. But that's not always the way it works. In fact, one of the best of the discipline cases that I've been involved with in Missouri was for a nurse in the cardiothoracic unit. And the other nurses just didn't like him. Now, I think he probably would have made a really good respiratory therapist because he was a little bit of a smart aleck, and that's sort of a necessary trait for respiratory therapists. We tend to be that way. And as a result, they got really irritated with him, and they set up this plan to make his life miserable. They went and they got propofol bottles and put it in the rooms where his patients were for that night. And then, after putting that in the sharps containers, one of them had him, in the middle of a very busy time, pull out some propofol out of the Pyxis for her. And one thing led to another. He came in 6 days later. He was on a shift where he got 6 days off, and then he worked, I think, 4 days and then 6 days off. He had a really good schedule. And he came in, and they basically said, you almost killed these two patients, and we're firing you. He got no due process. He got no right to challenge any of this at the hospital. And the hospital reported him to the state board, and the state board filed a complaint against him. And basically the state board said, we will revoke your license, but you can reapply in 5 years to get your license back. And he came to me and said, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, all cases are defensible, and that case was especially defensible because the key element of the case was these patients were found to be obtunded after 8 o'clock. And the assertion was that he had given them propofol to sleep them so they'd be easier to manage at night. That he'd given them propofol before he left at 6:30 in the morning. Now, does anybody know what the key element of evidence is here that says our guy didn't do anything. The half-life of propofol is about 19 minutes. So if these patients had been obtunded at 7:30, they might have had something to go on. But at 8:30, 8 o'clock, absolutely not. The state put up its first witness, and on cross-examination, I got him to admit that our guy did nothing wrong, and the case went downhill for the state from there, and he didn't wind up getting disciplined. But it wasn't the family he had to worry about because the families were never told what happened, which is also something that you need to sort of think about when you think about these things. Families never knew this had happened. So we were able to get him through that without any problem, and fortunately for him, he had malpractice insurance, and malpractice insurance will often cover defense at the state board level. Pardon me. So that all brings me back to the, sort of the golden rule. People do not sue people they like. The best defense you can have against any kind of a claim is for people to like you. Now, it doesn't mean you stretch the limits of truth or veracity or do things that are not ethically permitted to do, like give gifts or something like that. But basically, the better relationships you have with your patients, the better it is for you if there's ever a problem. The real key thing, I think, is that you have to come across and be perceived as caring and being willing to answer questions. So the real counterpart to that is that people don't have any problem at all suing people they do not like. And I think communication is probably the most important thing. I can't underscore enough how important it is, because it's really important that patients hear from you that you understand that they have questions and you want to try and answer it. I've had clinicians tell me patients have come to them and they've said, well, I'm not worried about that. Well, good. I'm glad you're not worried about that. Tell the patient why they shouldn't be worried about it. Because otherwise, if you don't tell the patient why they should be worried about it, they're going to continue to worry about it, and they're going to think that you're not paying attention to them. So, yeah, the other thing I want to make a mention of, I've had this come up in a couple of cases. If somebody says to you, I know my husband, Bob, and the guy laying in that bed in there is not Bob. He's not acting like Bob. Pay attention to that. Because when they tell you those kinds of things, it usually means there is something going on that they are aware of but can't put into words that you need to deal with. So a little tip there. And I want to tell the story to sort of really put the nail on the head here with regard to communication. A lot of times what we say, we think the patient understands. But a lot of times the patient doesn't understand what we're saying. Now, there was a fellow that was in the hospital, and he was recovering from minor surgery. And the nurse came in, and she was kind of a hippie-looking chick, a little bit like this gal. And she came in and said, I'm here to do your vital signs. And as she's working on doing the vital signs, he rolls over and says, so, how am I doing? Put his best, James Bond impression into work, trying to hit on the nurse, which, every man with a pulse is going to do at some point. So she looks at him and she says, you're not doing very good. Mercury's in Uranus. He says, I don't go in for all that astrology stuff. She said, yeah, neither do I. When you rolled over, you broke my thermometer. So, what leads to discipline? This is one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand. I did a study about 6 years ago now of discipline cases from California. You can go online in California and you can download all of the files and all of the pleadings in the state's discipline cases against respiratory therapists. And the one thing that stands out is that about 60 to 75% of these cases involve some form of substance abuse, either alcohol abuse or drug abuse. There are all kinds of examples in that. And thank you very much. And the one that I really enjoyed the most was the therapist who, after the patient had been pronounced dead about 2 hours earlier and they didn't get around to getting the body out of the room, she continued to give respiratory therapy to this patient and chart that the patient did well and tolerated it very well. Which is really hard to imagine how she had that information, but, you know. So let's talk a little bit about negligence versus gross negligence. As lawyers, we sue people for negligence all the time. I mean, it's sort of what we do. But there's a big difference between somebody who had a bad day and somebody who deliberately put themselves into a position to have a bad day. So if you run a red light, that's negligence. If you run a red light because you are drunk, that is gross negligence. The same thing can be applied in healthcare. If you miss 4 hours of ventilator checks because you're passed out in the bathroom, that's gross negligence, and that probably will affect your license. Now, sometimes arrogance is gross negligence. I had a therapist who went in and the doctor came in. He was managing these ventilators by protocol, and the doctor came in and said, well, you know, I know you're on protocol, but here's what I want to do. So he made ventilator changes. He actually went to the ventilator and made the changes himself, so it wasn't like they could do very much about it. In this particular hospital, that happened from time to time. So the therapist drew blood gases and didn't ice the sample. He ran the blood gases and he didn't like the results. So he waited about 10 minutes and then he ran the sample that had not been iced and was laying out there on the counter. And he liked those results and he reported it. And then he did the stupid thing that people do sometimes when they think they've gotten over on the system. He told somebody about it, and an ethical respiratory therapist said, "You did what?" And they reported him. He wound up losing his job, and he wound up with the state licensure people going after his license. Now, in the end, he didn't wind up with particularly bad particularly bad ending on that, but it was still a very bad situation. And it was all because he thought he knew more than the doctor in that particular instance. And maybe he did. But there is no right way to do the wrong thing. And unfortunately, that's something that sometimes people have to learn the hard way. So what happens when, in the discipline process, you have a patient or something else, some incident that causes the state or perhaps even local authorities or the hospital to investigate, and they conclude that a therapist has done something wrong. So they let the state board know, and the state board looks at that and files a complaint. So the next thing that happens is the agency sends a letter to the therapist and says, "You're a target." When they do that, a lot of times they will send a settlement offer. And they'll say, you know, we caught you doing this. We will, you don't have to go through the whole trial process. You can accept this settlement of, a probated license for a year or a reprimand, something like that. And sometimes that is the most cost-effective way to handle that situation, but not always. So if they decide they are going to prosecute this vigorously, they get an investigator involved, and the investigator is going to want to talk to you. And then the agency decides if they want to go forward, and they will file an actual complaint with the Administrative Hearing Commission or the Administration Hearing Division here in Florida. So I always tell people you do not want to talk to investigators without a lawyer present. And let me explain why. Oh, can you hear that?
When did you shoot it? What? At what point did you shoot the clerk?
I shot the clerk.
Yes, when did you shoot it?
I shot the clerk.
Hey, Dean, we need you out here. I'm in the middle of a damn confession here.
And that's why we don't talk to investigators. because there is literally nothing you can say that will get you out of trouble. Everything you say that you can say that helps you is not going to get written down, and everything that you can say that doesn't help you or hurt you, they are going to write down in boldface. They're going to underline it and star it and come back to it 3 or 4 times. Every client I've ever had has made things worse. I had a doctor once who had a little bit of a tiff with a former employee. He was male, she was female. He was also gay. And as a result, he wasn't really interested in his nurse hitting on him, but his nurse hit on him anyway. And as a result, she sort of made the situation unlivable, and he terminated her. So she came back into the office one day and said, I want to look at the employee manual. So the office manager showed her in and put her in the office and let her look at the employee manual, and then she left about 45 minutes later, and the next day, the state investigator came in and said, I want to look in that cabinet. And when he looked in that cabinet, there was a whole bunch of prescription pads that had been stamped with the doctor's signature. And the nurse basically alleged that he was just handing out prescriptions to anybody who wanted them. And fortunately, the state investigator was stupid and told the doctor he had to destroy all of those prescriptions. Then they decided they wanted to go after his license, and as a result, they had no evidence. So I was able to get the case dismissed. But that is not the way it usually goes. Again, if you talk to the investigators, a lot of times you say things that wind up hurting you, and indeed that's what the doctor did. He admitted to one of the investigators that, yeah, those things were in there. But there's a little thing called the best evidence rule that says you have to have the best evidence of a writing, and if you don't have that, you can't get it admitted, so they couldn't prove their case. Every case is defensible, though. The case that I told you about earlier with the blown blood gas, where the guy was sort of arrogant. The state started out with, you can get your license back in 5 years, and then we'll put you on suspension for 3 years, then we'll put you on suspension for 1 year, and I kept pushing and pushing and pushing until finally they just let him off with a letter of reprimand. So every case is defensible, but you have to have somebody who does that kind of work. You have to have somebody who does work in the area of administrative law, who understands the hearing process. Sometimes those are hard to find, but they are worth finding if you ever have a discipline problem. And a lot of times, if you have malpractice insurance, the malpractice agency can help you. So the second question that I got that I wanted to talk about was what to do about short staffing, particularly in the situation where you have absolutely too much work to do. There is no way in an 8-hour or a 12-hour shift you can get that work done. What do you do? So before I talk a little bit about what you can do, I want to tell you a story about a case that I was involved in as a lawyer involving a nursing home called Clay West. Now, you may wonder, what does that have to do with respiratory care? It doesn't have much to do with respiratory care, but it does have a lot to do with poor staffing, because the nursing home administration told their people that they could never have more staff than 40% of the Medicare budget. Well, you cannot arbitrarily limit your staffing on the basis of a number like that. And as a result, all kinds of stuff fell through the cracks. And of course, they wound up hiring people who should have been hired as certified nurses' aides. They wound up just hiring people off the street. One of the nurses in a deposition said, we had people call in because they were in jail. So one of the guys who was involved in this was a guy who had been wanted on a drive-by shooting in Mississippi. When he went up to St. Louis, Missouri, where this case was involved, and applied to work at the nursing home, instead of running a background check, they just hired him because they had already hired his sister. His sister worked there. Well, as you probably noticed earlier, I was coughing, and sometimes when you cough, particularly when you're trying to quell that cough, a lot of times you'll cough stuff up. Well, Marshall Rhodes coughed accidentally and sprayed medicine all over this guy, and he had no sense of humor about it. He took the leg off of a wheelchair and beat the man, and he beat him so bad that he died. When he went to the hospital, the nurses from the nursing home told the hospital that he had fallen out of bed. Well, his bed was 6 inches off the floor. He couldn't have fallen out of his bed and had that happen. The CEO of the nursing home company wound up going to jail for a year for failure to report that abuse. And the judge in that case said he had never seen a criminal jury that mad before. Imagine that. I want to tell you a little bit about Ruth Cawthon. Ruth Cawthon had two wonderful daughters, and the daughters went to see their mom pretty much every day at the nursing home. And this is a deposition or something from a deposition. Did everybody hear the audio on that last one? Was it good? Okay. So let me make sure I'm all the way up. I want to play this particular video because it's pretty interesting. This is the deposition that was taken in that case by one of my friends, Tim Dollar.
I can't call on anybody.
And when we're talking about Ruth Cawthon, we're talking about a situation in which she was literally covered in ants.
Covered.
From head to toe.
Yeah, she had ants everywhere.
They were swarming all over her body. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And are you aware that her daughters came into the facility to visit their mother and walked into the room and found their mother completely covered in ants?
Let me show an objection to the theatrics and asking the question and to the leading nature. You know, if we're putting on a play, fine, but you've been going a little bit overboard with
Now listen to the answer.
gross. Yeah,
It's what?
It's gross. I mean, they were crawling in areas that theatrics were needed.
Well, tell me about that.
It was
What do you mean?
bad.
What do you mean?
They were crawling in and out by her vagina. They were on her face, around her ears. I mean, it was really bad. It was bad. I didn't know the family had found her like that. I just know that at the time they had come to really do it. So one, get out of the room.
So that was, I think, a pretty appalling case of somebody just not doing their job. You know, they didn't check on this woman, and as a result of that, the problem with it was that they didn't discover it until it was well past the point where they could have prevented it. So another patient there, he was burned with cigarettes. He didn't burn himself. The burns were in places he couldn't reach. So he was burned with cigarettes. At the end of this case, the CEO and chairman were barred from Medicare for life because of what went on there. But you know who did not get disciplined? It was the nurses and staff that had left the facility and helped the United States government and the state government with the claims against the nursing home later on. The ones that came in and said, yeah, we worked there, but we couldn't work there more than a week because we saw what was going on and we just had to leave. It wasn't worth it. So protecting yourself is important. You know, documentation helps, right? You want to make sure that you document what goes on. If you have a problem, you document it and you bring it to your supervisor's attention. When you're in a situation where it's a one-time thing, where all of a sudden, you know, there was a big bus wreck or something out in front of the hospital and you just didn't have enough staff on that day, triage is an acceptable solution to that problem. But you have to document your clinical decision-making. Why do you have to document your clinical decision-making? Well, I want you to put yourself in the mindset of somebody who was in a spaceship and just landed in South Florida. And he's driving down the road and he starts seeing all of these signs about, you know, what to do if you are injured. You know, they would obviously think that humans were the most clumsy people in the entire world because every other billboard you see is for an accident and injury lawyer. And unfortunately, these work. You know, basically, it's come down to lawyer advertising being, you know, have you been hit by a meteor? It might be somebody else's fault. Give us a call. So that's the reason why you want to document, because there are lawyers who are going to be looking at it. And if they wind up suing the hospital, that's okay. You don't want to be on the hook too. But in terms of staffing, I know from personal experience that a lot of times when I was a therapist, when I was a therapist manager, I would go and I would beg for more staff, and they would, well, the budget just won't handle that. It's like, well, but we got patients that we can't get to because we don't have enough staff. And they just turned kind of a blind eye. And so in any situation where that happened to me in my career, I left the hospital. And that is pretty much what your remedy is if you can't get positive change. You have to leave. There's a lot of other places to work. Now, one of the things that happens when I tell people this is people say, well, but I've been there for like 2 years, and I've moved into an apartment. I don't want to move. And it's like, those are all excuses. There's a lot of other places you can work where what you do will be valued. And if your employer does not value what you do, then you're not working in a place that should comport with your ethical values, and you need to do something about that. Now, complaining is one thing you can do to bring it to the attention of the people who manage the unit or the hospital and let them know what's going on. Look, we're not getting to these treatments, and I realize we're not billing for a lot of these treatments because they're Medicare patients, but it's dangerous. Somebody's going to get hurt. So the other thing that's you can do, I don't necessarily recommend it, but you can file a whistleblower lawsuit. If the government is not getting what it's paid for, then that can be a false claim. The problem with getting the state or the federal government or your state board involved in any of this is that you're going to get fired. That's not a possibility, that's a guarantee. And they'll always find some excuse other than the fact that you ratted them out to lay at your feet. You were 13.2 seconds late getting to the punch-in clock. Whatever it is, they will do their best to insulate themselves from the consequences of terminating you. And I would also point out that a lot of state agencies have a terrible record of protecting patient rights. If you look at what happened in the nursing homes in the northern states, I think there's pretty good evidence that everybody was looking the other way when that was happening. One of my early experiences in respiratory care was at Kirksville Osteopathic Hospital. We had a nurse that we worked with on 3rd floor who came in for some digestive issues, and she coded. And her 2 daughters did not want her maintained on life support. They demanded that she be removed from life support. Well, the resident told them no. So they contacted the attending, and the attending told the resident to remove the endotracheal tube. And the resident said no. So the doctor got me on the line and said, you need to pull the endotracheal tube. And I said, no, I am not going to pull this woman's endotracheal tube. So the doctor came in and he pulled the endotracheal tube, and the first words out of her mouth were, oh my God, I need air, I need air. And she died 30 minutes later. So, I've never had any regret about not pulling that tube. The only thing I've really regretted was not doing more to stop it. And, those are some of the lessons that I've learned in healthcare that I carry with me for the rest of my life. So sometimes we all feel like this. It's a great little poem about it's not my job to run the train, the whistle I don't blow. It's not my job to say how far the doggone thing can go. It's not my job I'm not allowed to pull the brake or even ring the bell, but let the darn thing jump the track and see who catches hell. A lot of times, that's sort of the story of working in a hospital, But here's something that's really important to remember. You are not responsible for anybody's choices but yours. Your bosses are responsible for their choices. The hospital and its management are responsible for their choices. And the best way that you can deal with a situation is to bring it to the attention of people in the chain of command and do it in a calm and professional manner. Now, I get it. Your job is important to you. It's how you feed your family. You don't want to have to change jobs because you have an issue that is, sometimes a problem. But if it's all the time a problem, then I think you need to think seriously about complaining. People often say, well, how do you complain? Well, basically what you do is you go in and you speak directly to the manager and you say, we don't have enough staff. things are getting missed. We don't have enough therapists to cover the ICU or the CCU or the ER. And if something happens in one of these places and we don't have a therapist, people could die, we could wind up being sued. And I need to bring it to your attention. And then after you've done that, you want to document it. But you want to stick to just the facts. A lot of times people come in and it's, well, it's kind of like this is what it is.
This Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling. 40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
And that's not the way to complain. So, how do you do it? What I would recommend, back in 1981 when I was at Our Lady of Perpetual Billing, 1981 BB, which stands for before broadband, my idea of a portable phone was picking the phone up on the desk and moving it over to the other desk. But we all now have these wonderful portable phones and pocket phones that we can carry with us, and they almost all have memo features on them. And you hit that little button and you say, okay, on Saturday, May 4th, I talked to the ICU manager, and I explained to her that we did not have enough staff therapists to cover this unit, and that if there was a problem, she needed to call me. And then I reported that to my shift supervisor, and I asked my shift supervisor to let the department manager know. Your phone's going to time and date that, and then when you get home, write it down, document it, put it in a file that is just yours. And that is a good thing to do because it documents that you sounded the alarm, okay? If anything else, if nothing else, it shows that you were trying your best to get the care for the patients, even if nobody else was. So, somebody once said that once is happenstance, okay? One day when we don't have enough staff, that's happenstance. Twice, that's a coincidence. 3 times is enemy action, which means if it continues on, what's happening is nobody is listening to the alarm bell. There's a great article, I'm trying to remember the last name, I believe it's Stephen Foster, but it's called Crying Wolf in the ICU. And it's about how over time, people have learned to ignore the alarm bells on machines that they don't believe are accurate because the machines are crying wolf. Well, a lot of times, hospital administrators get into that same line of thinking. They're always complaining about not having enough staff. Nobody ever seems to take it to the next level and consider, well, gosh, I wonder if they do have enough staff. But personally, I'm very thankful that some hospitals do that, like Clay West, that they did that, because I think after all was said and done, we wound up with about $11 million in damages from those. And that's a pretty decent-sized chunk of change. I hate the fact, and I do hate the fact, that all those patients were harmed. But accountability does come. The hospital, or the nursing home association that they were part of, it wound up being sued into bankruptcy. And they wound up essentially exhausting all of their insurance. So I want to talk a little bit about the law of unintended consequences. Not doing something and just doing your best is, that's also an option you have, but it carries with it its own set of problems. Sometimes we do things and we think we have the problem solved and we don't, and our solution turns out to be worse than the thing that we are trying to fix. There's a story about a farmer, and he has watermelons, and every night somebody comes by and steals at least one of those watermelons. So he decides, okay, I've got a fix for this. And he sticks a big sign up in his watermelon patch that says, one of these watermelons has been poisoned. So the next day, he comes in and he finds that none of his watermelons are missing. But the sign has been changed, and it now says 2. So, sometimes the solution is worse than the problem. But I want to talk for a moment about Efren Saldivar. Does anybody here not know who Efren Saldivar is? Okay, Efren Saldivar was a therapist out in California who killed people, at least 6 of them. He was prosecuted and charged and convicted for 6 of them with Pavulon in the intensive care unit. He would draw little X's through the eyes on the big board they had with the patient names. He would draw little X's through the eyes. He worked at Glendale Adventist in California, and one of his fellow friends there helped him gather Pavulon and Anectine to give to these patients. And whenever he decided that a patient just didn't need to live anymore, he'd go inject them and they'd die. So one of his coworkers, in order to play a prank on him, who didn't know anything about this, opened up his locker and found Anectine in there and told the manager. And the manager basically said you should never have opened his locker. They never did anything to him until it wound up coming out that all these patients died and they'd been murdered. So the hospital took no action against Efren Saldivar at the time they found the Anectine in his wall locker. But they did take action against the whistleblowers, which sort of gets back to what I said before. They're always going to get after the person who blows the whistle. But imagine that you're a supervisor today and somebody applies for a job and they worked at Glendale Adventist at the time when Efren Saldivar did. Are you going to want them on your staff? I mean, if they knew, even if they didn't know, don't you think they're a little tarnished? And that's what I mean by the law of unintended consequences. You see, you're going to see things in your career that nobody else is going to see, and it's going to be up to you to blow the whistle and to let people know. And the reason to do that is twofold. 1, it will save a life, and 2, you will not have to live with the regret. And that brings me to one of my last sides here, malpractice insurance. One of the things that people say is, well, you know, that'll make it more likely that I'll get sued. I'm a lawyer. If I could find a list of people who had malpractice insurance, I would be the smartest lawyer in the world, and I am not the smartest lawyer in the world, because there is no list of people who have malpractice insurance unless it's kept by the people who sell malpractice insurance, and they sure don't let that come out to trial lawyers, right? Sometimes they don't even let people know who are defense lawyers. So malpractice insurance protects you in 2 situations. It protects you from a judgment against you directly. You're sued because, you know, somebody died in the ICU. It protects you there. It protects you if the hospital is sued and the hospital decides, well, we'll pay them $300,000 to make them go away. There is a provision in the law called indemnity. It's under the old common law of master and servant. And basically what it says is the servant is responsible for his torts. He has to indemnify the master. If the master is sued, then the indemnity essentially requires him to pay the master back for money that was expended on his behalf. So malpractice insurance protects you in that instance as well. And then the third way that it protects you, as I said before, is most of these policies have a provision in them that will allow you to get defense of your case if the state board comes after you. So I'm going to open the floor up for some questions because I think that would be really good, but a couple of ground rules. 1, don't tell me who your employer is. Don't provide any confidential information. No patient information. HIPAA still applies. And I can't give you legal advice in Florida because I'm not a Florida lawyer. I'm a Missouri lawyer. But I can point you in the right direction of maybe what questions to ask. So before we get to that, one last thing, and it was mentioned earlier, I've written a book called Lessons from Life in a Lab Coat, and it's basically about my journey through respiratory care. And some of the stories that I shared with you today are in that book. And I would like to think that there's a little bit of humor in there. You'll laugh, you'll cry. But hopefully, you'll get a little bit of a perspective on what it was like, at least in the early 1980s, to be a respiratory therapist in Florida and other places. And part of the profits go to the American Respiratory Care Foundation. American Respiratory Care Foundation does really wonderful work. I was on the board up until this year. I resigned in April because I've been way too busy to go to the meetings, and it's unfair to the board to ask them to accommodate me. So, but I do still believe very much in the mission of the American Respiratory Care Foundation, and I would urge anyone to support it. So, if anybody has any questions, now's the time. Yes, sir, in the back, blue shirt.
Should we therapists be worried about the recent story with the nurse who was criminally prosecuted?
The AARC is going to have a webinar on that. I think the 14th is what, I think it's a Saturday on the 14th, and I'm going to be doing it. But, you know, I guess I would have to be careful and say, let me tell you why I wouldn't worry about that. There are some peculiar facts in that situation. First of all, this is very much like the cardiothoracic nurse. It's a Pyxis issue. They based almost all of this on the Pyxis records. And Pyxis records are notoriously inaccurate. There are going to be a number of appeals in that case. And I think there should be. You know, she never denied that she made a mistake. But what she did deny was that she had, you know, been grossly negligent. Should you be worried? I think you should be cognizant of the risk. And that's one of the reasons to be very careful about what you document, because one of the things I always tell people is nobody ever got into court and said, gosh, I wish I hadn't have kept such good notes. What they say is, you know, I don't recall. You know, I've asked people about decedents, people who have died that were under their care, and I said, can you describe Judy Pollard for me? Well, no, I remember she was a little overweight, but that was, you know, what color hair did she have? Well, I don't know. So you really don't have any memory whatsoever of this patient, right? Yeah. All you have is your records, your notes, right? Right. And your notes say, tall well. What does that even mean? And so one of the things that I tell people is you cannot go wrong putting as much detail as you can, as time permits, obviously, into your records. Because eventually, in a situation where you do wind up getting sued or the hospital winds up getting sued, those can save you. Also, it's a good idea in any hospital to identify the people who are really on top of the science. I took a deposition once and I thought I had the world by the hind end because I was going to ask this guy about pulse oximeters. So I asked him, you know, well, how does a pulse oximeter work? And I'm thinking he's going to say, well, you know, you clip it on the finger and you push the button and, you know, a number pops up. That's because that's the way a lot of nurses talk about it. And he started talking about 660 nanometers and 990 nanometers and an impedance plethysmograph. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm not getting anywhere with this guy. So, you know, it is important to know who the people are because the lawyers are going to ask, who should we talk to about the pulse oximeter? Who should we talk to about the mechanical ventilator? And you get the people who really know their stuff, and they will help your defense lawyers understand the case. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the case, but it means you have a much better chance. Here's the other thing that I think is really important. In terms of medical negligence, defendants win 75% of the cases that go to trial. Now, that's not because 75% of the cases are non-meritorious. It's because, one, you have good karma. Nobody wants to think they're going to a doctor who's an idiot. And two, because the cases that are really good, like the case of the guy that in Kansas who was given vincristine intrathecally, those settle because, you know, that there's no defense to them. And occasionally those cases settle. But 75% of the ones that go to trial, the ones that are close calls, are resolved in favor of the defendant. And the other thing is, the people who prosecute these criminal cases, generally speaking, are from the Attorney General's office. And unless it's a high-profile case, they know absolutely nothing about medicine. Now, in that case in Louisville, I think it was in Louisville, wasn't it? Nashville, I'm sorry. That case in Nashville, they brought in experienced medical malpractice attorneys to work as trial counsel, which is sort of like gilding the lily, I think. But, you know, anytime you have a patient death under mysterious circumstances like that, it's important to do as quickly as you can to write down everything you remember about that, particularly if there is any chance somebody's going to get in trouble for it. Yes, sir.
One more quick question. I noted in one of your slides you mentioned audio recording.
Yes.
Now, you were probably referring to that therapist giving his personal account of
Yeah.
recording.
Right.
And that just led to a kind of a non sequitur. Let's say that you wanted to defend yourself by recording someone else's tale of what really happened without that person's knowledge. That against the law.
I don't know whether it is in Florida or not. There is a website called Can I Tape, and it has by law, by state by state, the rules with regard to audio recording and video recording. That's the best place to check. But you should not assume that it is okay. Yes, sir.
So I work in transport, we work on the aviation side. We talk a lot about just culture. And we talk about the links in the chain of an accident. Usually it's 4 links in a systematic breakdown.
Absolutely.
So in medicine, how often, Tony, do you find, it's not really an individual, but more of a systematic breakdown that leads to these incidents, like the law national?
That is such a spot-on question. Let me talk about that for just a moment. So, a gentleman who is about 80 years old goes in to see his doctor, and his doctor decides, I'm going to put a pacemaker in. So they take him into the hospital, they put the pacemaker in, and he goes home, and he starts having a cough. And the cough gets worse, and it gets worse. And he goes to his family doctor, and he says, man, I got this cough. So they give him cough medicine, and they give him an antibiotic, and it doesn't help. And he keeps going back to the doctor saying, you know, I'm just so tired, and I can hardly move. You know, some days I just can barely get out of bed. He's like, well, you know, sometimes that happens when you get a little cough like this. You know, just rest, you'll be fine. So he finally follows up and goes to the hospital, and he gets admitted. And when they put him on CCU, because his blood pressure is so low, they find out that his pacer leads were reversed. His dual chamber pacemaker was pacing the ventricle and then the atrial. And as a result, he developed congestive heart failure, and they didn't find it until the morning before he died. Well, the morning he died, he probably would have survived, except he told the nurse he had to go to the bathroom, and she got him up out of bed and sat him on the commode. And he tried to go to the bathroom and coded. And so that's a perfect example of what happens when you have a system error. The first system error is the insertion of the pacemaker leads that's wrong. The second error is not catching it when you do the follow-up exam. The third error is the private practitioner saying, well, you know, it must just be a little bit of bronchitis, and not actually going ahead and following up and doing the due diligence to figure it out. And then when he goes into the hospital, even though he's got a blood pressure of 60 palpable, a nurse puts him on the commode, and that's like the final chain. And you're right, there are always multiple chains. Almost every one of the cases that I've been involved in, a good case out of Kay County, Oklahoma, where a little 2-year-old girl came in for tonsillectomy, and she had a salt pore solution, D5 quarter normal saline, put in. And after the surgery, instead of DCing the IV, the LPN, who was not IV certified, about 15 minutes after she was transferred into the room, wrote on the chart, new bag hung. And the reason the new bag was hung is because a full liter of salt pore solution went into a 25-pound child. So what happens, right? She starts, instead of waking up, she starts getting more somnolent. She starts having emesis. They're like, that's the anesthesia. Nobody draws any meds. Nobody draws any bloods, to find out what's going on. No labs are sent. And then it keeps happening. And so the doctor says, well, give her let's just give her some Tygan suppository. That'll help with that emesis. The nurse goes to get the Tygan suppository and gives it, and then realizes she is given an adult dose Tygan suppository. She reports her error. The LPN never did. She reports her error, and the doctor says, well, let's call poison control. Poison control says, well, watch for extrapyramidal shaking symptoms. So when the child has a full-blown seizure because her intracranial pressure has skyrocketed, they say, well, you know, it must be extrapyramidal shaking from the Tygan, and they give her pentobarbital or phenobarbital, whatever it is. And basically, she wound up having a Cushing's reflex, and her brainstem herniated, and she died. And again, error after error after error after error. And all of it could have been prevented with a Buretrol or an IV pump. But it wasn't, because it was a small county hospital and money talks. So you're absolutely right. That is a terrific point. Thank you for that. That was really helpful. Other questions? How am I doing on time? Getting pretty close. Anybody else? Any other questions? I thought I saw a hand over here earlier. Well,
follow up to the Dr. Bob case in Nashville.
yes.
So I think that a lot of the concern is because of her conviction, it sets a case precedent. And so where for 20 years now we've been working to get people to report medical errors, the concern now is that people will be afraid to report medical errors because they could potentially be criminally liable. So,
well, I think there's always a tension there, but it is this fear of reporting medical error that killed that 25-pound child. You know, I don't know how you fix that problem. In terms of it being precedential, it's precedential in Tennessee. It is not precedential anywhere else. It might be vaguely helpful in another case in another state, but every state's law in this regard is very different. I mean, that was essentially an involuntary manslaughter case there, and the law on manslaughter varies from district to district. It is unbelievably complicated, and that's one of the reasons why criminal attorneys get paid so much. Criminal defense attorneys, criminal attorneys wind up going to jail. Just ask Gavinotti. But I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to what is effectively my home state society. I still maintain my membership with the AARC, but for some reason they've put me in the Alabama Society because I also have a house in Alabama, but my voting residence is actually in Destin, Florida. So I just want you all to know that I was happy to come, and I'm always happy to come back. My email address, if anybody wants to write it down, is ALDewitt, ALDEWITT, at ALDEWITT.com. And if you have a question or you want to email me about something, please, in the subject line, put "saw you at the FSRC." Thanks again, guys. You were a great group of people to talk to.